Good morning again, everybody. Thank you so much for being here in Harrisonburg, Virginia, in the heart of the National Historic District that is comprised of the 8 counties of the Shenandoah Valley. We at the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation are thrilled to have you all here. We're doubly thrilled to have this amazing panel of speakers to talk to us today about Confederate icons, history, memory, and the future of our past. This is one of the largest conferences, one-day conferences that the Battlefields Foundation has ever had, and we think that it's going to be an amazing day. So thank you very much to all of you who have traveled from 13 states and Canada to be here with us today. I want to especially thank our trustees of the Battlefields Foundation, some of whom are in attendance, for having the foresight and the fortitude to hold this conference. I'd also really like to thank C-SPAN and American History TV for being with us today and for broadcasting this live nationwide for audiences at home. This topic has been one that has been the subject of much debate. It has been the subject of much consternation nationwide. And all of us here have watched as this topic has played out across our television screens, as this has been debated in small towns and large cities and around kitchen tables and dining room tables across the nation. We at the Battlefields Foundation are committed to preservation. Congress established us in 1996 to preserve and protect the Civil War heritage and culture and the battlefields across which the Civil War was fought here in the Shenandoah Valley. For those of you who may not know, the Shenandoah Valley was akin to the Gaza Strip of the Civil War. There was always something happening in the valley. Over a 4-year period, there was a battle, engagement, or skirmish somewhere in this 8-county area every 3 to 4 days. The people who lived here could not escape the sounds, smells, or sights of war for 4 years. And Congress in 1996 felt that that was an important story to preserve and protect because the battles that were fought here in the valley, the experiences of the people who lived here at that time, helped shape American history, not just the valley's history, not just Virginia's history, but America's history. The men who fought across these fields, not far from where you sit today, marched into history. And they left behind a complicated past for their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, and today their great-great-grandchildren to wrestle with. The Battlefields Foundation has preserved almost 5,000 acres directly. Much of that has been done with the support of many of you here in this room. We preserved an additional 8,000 acres by being the wind and the sails of other organizations and providing all the background work needed for those organizations to preserve acreage on their own. This experiment that Congress came up with in 1996, this National Historic District, has been extremely successful. But saving the land was not the only thing that Congress established us to do. Protecting the story, using these landscapes as outdoor classrooms and places of remembrance, and places where we could safely debate the meaning of our past and our future as a nation was all part of what our mission was to be. We would not, as the Battlefields Foundation, feel like we were living up to what we were called to do if we were to shy away from this very sensitive topic. Confederate icons, history, memory, and the future of our past. Really, for those of us who care about our history, and for those of us who know a little something about our history, and for those of us who are here today, there is hardly any more central theme that would be more important for us to discuss. We believe at the Battlefields Foundation that it's the lack of conversation, that it's the lack of discourse, it's the lack of coming together in groups like this one to discuss, debate, pontificate, and share opinions. It's the lack of that that will be the problem in the future. The Battlefields Foundation is proud to have brought this panel of folks together, each one of them lions in their field, each one of them well-respected, each one of them highly intelligent, well-spoken, well-meaning, and caring, and each one of them with a slightly different opinion, a slightly different viewpoint. We're very proud to bring them together so that we can foster a continued discussion, a continued discourse, because it's only through discussion and debate and finding commonalities that we're going to be able to shape and make a strong, better future for our children and our children's children. And I don't think anyone here would disagree with me that if we are going to have a strong, bright future, in some way that future has got to be rooted in a true understanding of our past. The question is, what is a true understanding of our past? And that's what we're here to discuss today. Now, we have some ground rules for today. There are going to be things that people here say that you may not agree with. That's the whole purpose of this event. We don't want everybody here to agree. We want everybody here to share. We want everybody here to listen with an open mind, not just open ears. We'd also like you all to search your hearts and try to see things through other people's viewpoints as you're listening today. We would ask you to be extremely respectful of the speakers. They have all come here knowing full well that they may be facing some folks that don't agree with them. But they've come here because they feel as passionately about these things as you do. So we would ask that you be extremely respectful of the speakers. We would also ask that you be extremely respectful of one another. And we would also ask that you refrain from any large display of mutual agreement. We would like this to be a safe place, not a safe space, but a safe place for us to share with one another our thoughts, our feelings, our viewpoints. To that end, I'm going to be the heavy today. To that end, we have microphones at each side of the room, and if the speakers allow time, and some of them may and some of them may not, we will have an opportunity for each and every one of you to move over to the speaker or the microphone and ask a question. We are not going to allow people to get up and make a statement. We have our list of speakers set for the day, and unfortunately we have no time for any additional ones. We would love for you to have the opportunity to ask a question, but if you have a statement that you're making, you will be cut off. Likewise, if your question begins to smack of something that is a loaded question or is disrespectful, you will be cut off. However, we are fine with a heated debate, and so I ask you just to be respectful. The other thing that I would ask is when you go to lunch this afternoon, try and sit with somebody you don't know. Share your thoughts and opinions, and let's get that conversation going today that we need to be fostering nationwide. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. I don't think there's anybody here that really needs to hear much of an introduction, because this man's someone who all of us know and love dearly. And I'm talking, of course, of Dr. James I. Bud Robertson. And Dr. Robertson is one of the most distinguished names in Civil War history. Think about this for a second. Dr. Robertson, the man who's going to be speaking to you in just a few minutes, worked with President Kennedy to help design and lay out the 100th anniversary of the American Civil War. He worked with President Kennedy's family, unfortunately, to help plan his funeral so that it would have the same pomp and circumstance as Lincoln's. He worked with the Johnson administration to finish out the work that he had started with President Kennedy. He's the author of more than 40 books, including such award-winning studies as The Civil War, America Becomes One Nation, and that wonderful book about General A.P. Hill, Soldiers Blue and Gray, and of course, Stonewall Jackson, the man, the soldier, the legend. That particular book won 8 individual awards. He has been hailed as the father of Virginia's state song, the anthem, Our Great Virginia, with moving lyrics to the tune Shenandoah, which of course is near and dear to our hearts here. It was adopted as the state song in 2015, and now solidly in his 80s, he has not slowed down much at all. His recent books include The Untold Civil War that he worked on with National Geographic, After the Civil War, also with National Geographic, and Civil War Echoes and Voices from Virginia, 1859 to 1891. And he's currently working on an encyclopedic dictionary of Robert E. Lee. I am humbled that this man even knows my name, and I am proud that he's here today. I'd like to introduce to you our dear friend, Dr. Bud Robertson.
Thank you, Kevin, and good morning, everyone. For the first time in my 60-year career, I must say that I take no pleasure in the talk I'm about to give. Yet it is time that the other side be heard in this monument for Lee. And further, as the keynote speaker for your conference, and I'm humbled by that, plus the fact that I'm the eldest member of the cast by a number of years, I will occasionally drift far afield to discuss the national issues of which Civil War monuments are part, and to the factors that lay behind the insanity under which we live in many sections. I understand and I respect those whose friendship I may damage here. But that being said, once we fought a civil war, that 4-year bloodbath was the most vital moment in our evolution as a nation. Slavery was the underlying issue behind the war, but it was not the only issue, not the only issue. State rights still hovered over the land. The limits of federalism were far from resolution, and no one seemed to realize how easily emotions can conquer reasonable thinking. The United States in which you and I live was born in 1865. Civil War marked the conception of the country we know. It was the greatest sacrifice we have ever made toward nationhood and unity. All over our land now can be found markers and monuments recognizing the terrible ordeal through which we passed before we could honestly call one another fellow countrymen. Forgetting the war, in other words, is impossible. We cannot have life without birth. Today, sadly, we seem to be stepping backward, historically, politically, morally, culturally. This is a time that future history textbooks may well label the age of idiocy. Our politics have become radicalized by the flaming belief on both sides of the aisle that we are engaged in a life and death struggle for the soul of the nation. Intolerance exists where courtesy once prevailed. Violence is a constant threat that looms over us like storm clouds. We are assailed almost daily by irrational activists. And first, I dismiss out of hand those who wander in a dream world under the name neo-Nazis, skinheads, neo-Confederate, Southern Legion, and the like. They have no knowledge, and hence they have no respect for the principles embodied in Robert E. Lee. And further, the pure and holy Confederate states they envisioned never existed. Those groups did not gather in Charlottesville or Richmond to honor Lee. If they had, with genuine intent, they would have done so unarmed, and their efforts would have focused more on reconciliation and less on incitement to riot. The so-called anti-protesters, and that's the greatest example I know of the word oxymoron, the anti-protesters played right into their hands. These troublemakers gave the extreme right publicity that they could not themselves generate because of the senselessness of their movements. Lee certainly would have no forbearance for this new wave of Confederate feeling, and neither do I. On the other side of the spectrum, the left wing, perpetually offended in our country, are at it again. Their policy has always been to deny the past, exploit the present, ignore the future. And now their targets are Confederate monuments. And armed with historical ignorance, as well as misguided protests and childish emotions, activists want to take away your history by first dismantling your memorials. Our land is infested with elements hell-bent on tearing apart the unity that generations of Americans have painfully constructed. It was not too long ago that we all took pride in America's the beautiful, the patriot's dream that sees beyond the years, the alabaster city's gleam, undimmed by human tears. What happened? Where did we go wrong? Where did the visions go? Well, here is the root to the whole problem. Probably 90% of our citizens cannot pass an American history exam. 90%. They have no idea what the Declaration of Independence is, who Abraham Lincoln was, in what war the atomic bomb was dropped. History is the greatest teacher you will ever have. It's my favorite expression. And we are the worst pupils in the class. Until 1,000 more American citizens become aware of the blessings of God and the evolution of our country, the buzzards will continue to squawk, and the uninformed will listen intently. They're too stupid to do otherwise. Common sense shows that one needs to learn more about our history and to qualify for passing judgment on any of our history. Monuments to the past are vital guides on the journey to the future. Historical statues do matter for reasons that are historical and economic and cultural and in some cases even political. Marble and bronze reminders compel us to look back, sometimes with pride, sometimes with anger. We need always to know where we have been. Otherwise, how can we know where we're going? My colleague Harold Holzer put it this way: when we demolish memory altogether and leave no trace of it for our children or theirs, we forget who we were, who we are, and how we can become something better. We are sporadically attacked by demagogic propaganda that purges fact and extols fantasy. There are those who, unable to tell you when the Civil War was fought, who want to tear down the statues of men they refuse to understand. We rob one group of citizens of their heritage in order to please another group who cannot even tell you the meaning of the word heritage. It is one of the ironies of history that the legacies of great men are always decided by lesser men. A problem in today's dysfunctional society is that great men are being slandered not by the uneducated, but by the uneducatable. Personal ignorance and irresponsibility, especially on college campuses, are replacing education and the search for truth. I call these agitators snowflakes. They appear suddenly, but vanish in the warmth of common sense and intelligence. They stretch the First Amendment to the breaking point, but they will not allow anyone else to express his or her First Amendment rights. Now, walk down the path of history is in order here, because while times change, history never does. Late on Sunday afternoon, April 9th, 1865, after the Confederate Army had surrendered at Appomattox, U.S. Grant rode back to his Union lines, and he found the men cheering, and he angrily told them to stop that yelling. Grant did so on the common ground sense that those who vanquished Southerners were fellow countrymen again. 35 years later, in 1901, and I'm quoting you legislation that is conveniently overlooked, especially by the media. In 1901, President William McKinley set aside a section of Arlington National Cemetery as a burial site for several hundred Confederate soldiers. Until that time, Southern soldiers could not be buried in the National Cemetery. A larger, forgotten step occurred in March 1906, and I doubt if anyone in here is aware of this piece of legislation. It's Public Law 38, Statute 56, and it states as federal law that Confederate soldiers were to be entitled to be treated as American veterans in the same honorable way that all American veterans of all other wars had been. In other words, you cannot segregate Confederate soldiers from Union soldiers. They were all American veterans entitled to the same. That's a 1906 statute. But in spite of these federal laws, Robert Lee and Stonewall Jackson and all other Confederate soldiers are now being declared traitors, symbols of racial hatred. Such allegations run counter to law and to common sense. But American politics thrives on a double standard. And the media continually demonstrates daily that it has difficulty in telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Now, the spark for the current war on monuments came in a terrible 2015 incident in Charleston, South Carolina. A deranged young youth murdered 9 black churchgoers, and in his belongings was a photograph of him holding a Confederate battle flag. Arguments over Confederate symbolism immediately began, and the flag, as it should have been, was removed from view on public grounds. Then the uneducated activists turned to Civil War monuments. And here in my beloved state of Virginia, statues are units unto themselves. We Virginians look on them a little differently, I think, than residents of other states. Our statues do not depict fighting or resistance. They are memorials to soldiers who defended their beloved state. What you have been told repeatedly in the last year is that Virginia first gave attention to its Civil War monuments in 1950 with the passage of a Monuments Protection Act, which is Virginia Code 5.2-1812, later amended in 1988. That is not correct. The original Monuments Protection Act was enacted by the General Assembly in February 1904. That law has been expanded, amended, revised, and refined 12 times in the last 114 years. On a dozen separate occasions, the state government has given attention to Civil War memorials. That Monuments Protection Act is not some piece of legislation gathering moss and dust on the back shelves of the state library. It is an active law. 12 times it has been brought up. And the original intent has always been the same. Quoting from the 1982 amendment, It shall not be lawful for the authority of any county or any other persons whatever, to disturb or interfere with any monuments. In the 1998 amendment, the General Assembly expanded the language disturb to include removal of, damaging, or defacing monuments or memorials. The reverence for monuments, first expressed in law in 1904, is still law in 2018. Put in simple words, monuments cannot be removed by the whims of a local agency or by some loudmouth seeking notoriety. A year or so ago, as you all know, the law was tested twice. First, Leesburg, then Alexandria, sought to bypass the law and take down tributes to the past. Both proposals were promptly shot down. The Charlottesville City Council had to know about these earlier failed efforts. It had to. They could not have been that stupid about the law. Nevertheless, Charlottesville officials in grandstanding fashion voted 3-2 to remove the Lee statue in a downtown park. And one of the three councilmen casting yes votes stated he felt the Lee monument to be, quote, culturally offensive. Well, shielding citizens from things that offend them is not the primary role of government. Feelings are by definition subjective. Principles of free speech demand that public figures and institutions value the feelings of citizens equally. Therefore, whether something is offensive to some is not by itself a sufficient justification for eliminating it. In order to represent everyone, civil government, and I might add college administrators as well, should objectively consider the overall contributions of individuals in the context of their time, rather than arbitrarily prioritizing the current feelings of certain people over others. But the Charlottesville disaster had a political base. Too many politicians are more than happy to cave in to the demands of a small but howling class, knowing that the courts, shielded from political jargon, will save them from the consequences of a bad decision. So in recent election, candidates for governor to city management followed one of the oldest and most hackneyed ploys. They demanded something that was already happening or was going to happen, so as to take credit for it when it did occur. This is base. It is cynical. It is blatantly hypocritical. It is American politics at work. And all of that noise and all of those demonstrations by the displeased in Charlottesville fortunately came to naught. Judges have twice rejected appeals for statue removal there. Nevertheless, in January of this year, a state delegate from Charlottesville introduced in the General Assembly a bill that would junk a dozen from 1904 on, a dozen earlier statutes, and allow local communities to decide the fate of historical monuments. Subcommittees in both House and Senate killed the measure at the first reading. And to me personally, it is sad that so many of my Democratic friends who have respect for history are having to take the other side in the statue removal for argument simply because the Republicans are for it, the Democrats have to be against it, and vice versa. It's not a way to run a country. It's not a way to run it at all. Politics should never supersede principle, but today it seems a way of life for legislative bodies at all levels. Polls in the last year, every single one, show that at least 70% of the electorate do not want monuments removed. They want them to remain where they are. Clearly, a minority does not have the right to override the majority. In Charlottesville, the more than $300,000 it would cost to remove the Lee statue, plus the enormous legal fees associated with the action, could be better used by a more enlightened city council in improving traffic congestion, especially on 29 North, creating scholarships for disadvantaged youth, perhaps putting up a statue of an African American, say Douglas Wilder. He was the Commonwealth's first black governor. Now, Governor Wilder does not have a spotless record, but who does? Wilder's impact on Virginia history is worthy of statuary remembrance. Of course, the Charlottesville City Council could really undertake self-improvement by sponsoring nighttime, unbiased courses, free courses in Virginia history and political science, if the council members themselves will take the courses. We must not ignore the presence in our land of a mob mentality, long on noise, short on knowledge. It is highly dangerous in a democracy. A silent majority is democracy's worst enemy. Some months back, airheads in academia, in the media, and on the streets castigated General John Kelly, the President's Chief of Staff. What unpardonable sin had the general committed? Kelly declared that failure of compromise was a primary factor in the coming of the Civil War. Activists thereupon exploded with indignation that something other than slavery might be behind the North-South struggle. In all my years as a professional historian, I have never witnessed a more pronounced, more pathetic ignorance of fact, especially when some of it originated with individuals who hold doctorates in history. That Civil War came from an inability to compromise has been a basic staple of Civil War history ever since the war ended. In the first half of the 20th century, Professor James G. Randall of the University of Chicago wrote what became the standard college textbook on Civil War history. I used it, and my classes for a while used it. And in his book, speaking of American thinking in the 50s, Randall asserted that, quote, that the 1850s was a sorry melange of party bile, crisis melodrama, inflated elegance, unreason, religious fury, self-righteous, self-deception, and hate. Allen Nevins of Columbia University was Dean of American Historians in the latter half of the 20th century. I knew Allen. He was chairman of the Civil War Centennial Commission. He's the only genius I've ever met. He wrote 55 books. He knew a little bit about history. His 5-volume Ordeal of the Union dominated the Civil War field for 30 years. And in one of those chapters entitled The Failure of Compromise, Nevins described Northern and Southern thinking in the immediate antebellum years as, quote, largely irrational, governed by subconscious memories, frustrated desires, and the distortions of politicians and editors. Now, slavery was the catalyst of the Civil War. No uneducated person can dispute that. Human bondage was so deeply rooted in the Western world that the feeling of white supremacy was too inherent to be challenged. Slavery was an integral part of American society. As such, it was subject to law. And the chief dispenser of law in this country is the United States Congress. And starting in 1846 and continuing for 14 consecutive years, Congress poked here and there for a solution to the slave question. And while representatives doodled, the national mood grew ugly. On one side were inflexible Northern abolitionists. On the other side were equally unbendable Southern fire eaters. And in between was that huge silent majority just waiting to see what was going to happen. The nation was simply too young and too weak to confront the magnitude of that crisis. Congress, as it usually does, talked much, said little, did nothing. A series of weak presidents in the 1850s offered no leadership. Only one Supreme Court decision on the issue passed, and half the nation promptly ignored it. Modern-day self-styled philosophers argue that nothing about slavery could be compromised. That in itself is an uncompromising position, because compromise and democracy are the same thing. You cannot have one without the other. You always have to have compromise. Last year on CBS Radio in Washington, I spent an hour discussing the monument issue with a leading official of the NAACP. We started at opposite ends of the spectrum. Yet as the minutes passed and our conversation leveled in tone, we began to see common ground. And by the end of the hour, moderator Peggy Fox said in amazement that my new friend and I seemed to be on the same path. Well, what agreements did we reach? Add plaques at monument sites to explain why individuals acted as they did in the context of their time. With the approval of both state and a clear majority of the electorate, take down the belligerent statues, preserve the hallowed memorials, and energetically work together toward producing more memorials. Such will increase accurate and more widespread knowledge of the past and better prepare us for the unknowns of the future. That is compromise. The very thing the Founding Fathers hoped future generations would always achieve, and how ashamed they would feel today. If imperfect men could get together and create from scratch a constitution for what became the world's greatest democratic nation, they surely could have found some solution other than civil war. For example, by 1860, slavery was dying of natural causes. Daniel Webster said that back in 1850. It was dying of natural causes because cotton is like tobacco. It saps everything out of the soil. And Edmund Ruffin was running late with his theory of crop rotation. And so in the Deep South, the planters would grow cotton in a field year after year after year until said field would not even grow weeds. Then they searched for other land, and they were desperately throughout the 1850s, pardon me, trying to find usable land for cotton, and certainly the new acquisitions, New Mexico, Arizona, California, offered no outlet for it. Slavery would have died naturally because its bumper crop, cotton, would have ceased to exist. And that's one compromise that could have come about. In addition, the Industrial Revolution was swinging into gear in the late 1850s, and industrialization would clearly surpass agriculture. The great land of farmers of which Jefferson envisioned never had a chance. And we would become an industrial nation, and the Cotton Kingdom would disappear. And so, in spite of these factors, neither side could agree. Southerners were too proud to admit what little the future held, and Northerners were too impatient to wait for the inevitable. Today's snowflakes damn the thought of compromise. That's the one continual factor. And that leads naturally to the basic question. Is the greatest collection of compromises in the English language the U.S. Constitution the next target for vilification? And if these nearsighted negativists are so dissatisfied with American ideals, why do they stay here? A whole world of different governments exists beyond our borders. Now, of particular disgust to me are the attacks being made on Robert Lee, who personifies the word noble more than any figure I have ever encountered. In that montage of mistakes in Charlottesville last August, Lee has been branded as the simple symbol of all that is repugnant in America. He raised his hand against his own flag, the voices shout. He joined the cause to keep 3.5 million blacks enslaved. He fought a war to destroy everything that was good and decent in our spotless land. Lee, his accuser's charge, is the predecessor of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. How outrageous these accusations are in the face of truth. Lee opposed slavery. As early as 1856, he called it an evil institution. He had no inkling for slavery, saw no reason for it. But his fear was what might happen if 3 million uneducated, ill-prepared slaves were suddenly dumped onto society without warning, without assistance, without direction. Would not freedom in that situation be even worse curse than the bondage they knew? He didn't know this. He didn't have an answer. But of this he was certain. God's hand was needed. And with God's help, emancipation would come to pass. That's how Lee felt about slavery. He never owned slaves. His wife did. He didn't. As for secession, Lee considered that to be nothing short of revolution. He had been a United States soldier for 30 years. He'd been a Virginian all of his life. And this brings me to a fact that people overlook. It's a basic fact, yet very few people ever get to it. It's essential that you understand. When the secession crisis came in 1860, the quote, United States was 70 years old. But the Lee family had been living in Virginia for 225 years. The young country was still struggling over where state rights ended and federalism began. And for Lee, the fateful decision he had to make in April 1861 was at the heart of that struggle. And this man, to whom devotion to duty was a faith, found that he simply could not forsake his birthright, namely Virginia. Lee did not resign from the United States Army to fight for the Confederate cause, the greatest misnomer in Civil War history. He left the Army to defend his state. Lee hoped that Virginia would be neutral in the contest. When he resigned from the Army, Virginia had just seceded. It was independent. It belonged to no group. But he hoped, as I said, that Virginia would remain neutral, which, of course, it could not. It was, by geography alone, the centerpiece for the war. However, had Virginia remained with the Union, Robert E. Lee would have fought for the Union. It's as simple as that. 70 years of a nation, 225 years for a birthright. And you have to think about that because it's totally opposite today. We now live under a federal government that does everything for us but breathe. In 1860, the federal government directly touched your life, directly touched it one way. It delivered the mail to your local post office. That's the only time you ever heard of Washington. You paid taxes to state and local authorities. You tried your cases in state and local courts. Rarely did you go beyond that. 10% of Americans in 1860 had never been out of their county, much less out of their state. It was all localism. There was no flag of which anyone was aware. We had no national anthem, no national motto. All of that comes later, thanks to the Civil War. But state was important at that time, and it still is to most of us. We Virginians talk so much about our history, we bore people. But we got more history than anybody else. So there's a lot we have to talk about. The hate mongers who swarm around Lee forget another more important facet of his life. Although he is remembered as one of the greatest military commanders of all times, I personally think that Lee's most enduring achievement came in the 5 years after Civil War. No American devoted himself more completely or toiled more constantly to bring reconciliation to a shattered nation than did Robert Lee. After Appomattox, Lee could have shown anger, bitter disappointment, deep-seated resentment, and the fires of civil war would have smoldered for years. Instead, in the face of failing health, Lee called for dedication to a new union and a careful, positive national healing. He set the course himself. Lee refused to discuss the war. He would not write his memoirs. He would not grant newspaper interviews. He would not attend veterans reunions or monument dedications. Today, Lee would be appalled to see the Confederate flag flying in the public. He labored as a college president and a church vestryman to produce an America motivated by national ideals and a strengthened faith in God. Was he successful? Oh, yes. In 1868, 3 years after Appomattox, a New York City newspaper endorsed Lee for President of the United States. Had he been elected, he could not serve. His amnesty had never been granted. He was not an American citizen. By 1868, abolitionist leader Henry Ward Beecher openly called him a friend. In 5 years, little bankrupt Washington College became a model in American higher education. And when Lee died in October 1870, hundreds of expressions of sympathy came in from all of the states, including the new state of Alaska, where a newspaper reporter there wrote a glowing eulogy. Lee would protest strongly against any monument to his memory, which in my thinking is a major reason he deserves them. Harry Truman once commented, "Men make history, not the other way around. In periods when there is no leadership, society stands still. Progress occurs when courageous, skillful leaders seize the opportunity to change things for the better." Several Lee statues exist. The most moving, of course, is that of Lee asleep in the field, and it is in the chapel at Washington and Lee, and efforts are underway to take it out. Another outstanding likeness of Lee is in Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol. Recently, one of our Virginia senators came up with the bizarre idea that the Lee statue in the Capitol be replaced with a likeness of Pocahontas, who was here before the Virginians were here, and she was dead at 21. The most famous equestrian monument was dedicated in 1890 in Richmond. Never was that memorial intended as a Jim Crow symbol of defiance, as myopic modern-day critics charge. One does not rush home from a war and start building memorials to yourself. Wars are traumatic events. It takes time to get over them and put life back into perspective. Wounds need to be healed. Money for the Lee Memorial came from ladies' associations and donations from veterans who had little money in the Reconstruction period. Controversy over the Lee Monument existed even from the beginning, I'll say as an aside. Some said the statue was too far from downtown Richmond. Others resented the fact that a French sculptor, not an American sculptor, was selected to do the Lee image. And good old ex-Confederate General Jubal Early complained bitterly because the stone for the monument came from the Yankee state of Maine, which he did not like. But of that bronze and stone memorial, the Richmond Times-Dispatch declared in July 2015, the Lee statue depicts one of America's greatest generals. The piece captures his military genius and personal character. The sculpture does not glorify an unworthy cause. It represents tragedy in the classical sense. And the base of the statue says simply, Lee, and nothing more needs to be added. Unfortunately, something else does need to be added. It is the most blatant example of hypocrisy in this entire monument controversy. But I first must confess a personal association. For much of my life, I was an active Episcopalian. I served repeatedly as senior warden and as senior lay reader at my Blacksburg church. I was also historiographer of the diocese, as well as one of the first laymen licensed by the bishop to pass the chalice at Holy Communion. And then in the late 1970s, the Episcopal hierarchy began shifting steadily toward the political left. And out went the wonderful, beautiful, prosaic Book of Common Prayer. And then came a new guidebook with wording, quote, more attuned to the times. And the ruling clergy in using today's parlance, wanted to have extremely diversified clergy and other things like that as they moved on, and I guess they reached the capstone in the 2016 election when you found political signs on the lawns of many Episcopal churches. I do not think the Episcopal Church, I don't think I left the church. I think the church left me. And lately that denomination has waged a systematic, sanctimonious persecution of Lee, one of the most devout Anglicans who ever lived. Lee has been called an abusive slaveholder, a traitor, a modern-day Judas. Episcopal leaders do not hesitate to mix politics into religion because that's at the root of the hypocrisy they practice. In the years before the Civil War, the Episcopal Church in the South was the least enthusiastic about the abolition of slavery. Why? The large slaveholders and the businessmen of wealth in the main belonged to the Episcopal faith. One does not bite the hand that feeds you. Yet Episcopalians were not merely bystanders in that antebellum period. The 1860 census for Virginia shows 112 Episcopal ministers living in the Old Dominion. Of those 112 clergy, 86 owned slaves. 3/4 of the clergy were participants in a system frowned upon then and soundly condemned now. The Episcopal Church denomination was among the first to establish a Confederate church. Over 100 Episcopal clergy served as chaplains in the Confederate armies. And this is now the denomination that lashes out at Confederates in general and Lee in particular. Just in our neighborhood, and all of you are aware of the fact, the Lee Memorial stained window was taken out of the National Cathedral. Dedicated 64 years earlier, it was removed, as was the plaque, on which were the words that Lee was a Christian soldier without fear and without reproach. That went in the dump too. And yet officials there today will be just delighted to show you the crypt of another VIP they have, Woodrow Wilson, one of the most outspoken segregationists of his age. The Lexington Church, long known as the Robert E. Lee Memorial Church, has changed its name. At Christ Church, Alexandria, where both Lee and George Washington worshiped, plaques to their memory were taken down because, said the minister, they made worshipers feel unsafe and unwelcome. And then she added, this is a church, not a museum. Oh? I looked up in my Webster's Intercollegiate Dictionary the definition of a museum. It is, quote, a building preserving artistic and historical objects. Since when has the worship of God not been artistic? And when people bow at the cross, is that not historical? Christians have been doing it for 2,000 years. The Episcopal Church, I'm told, has lost a fourth of its membership in the past 20 years, and it is now free-falling from its assaults on Lee, one of its most faithful members. Remember that the last public service Lee performed was to preside over a long vestry meeting on a cold October afternoon, and he went home and collapsed while offering thanks to God for the evening meal. The church is now falling, and seemingly nobody in that denominational hierarchy seems to care. So be it. Abraham Lincoln once commented, "Broken eggs can never be mended, and neither can broken monuments. History and collective memory are unchangeable. The ignorant want to banish forever the symbols of past oppression and injustice. Amnesia is not a remedy for anything. Eliminating the past has never been a successful means of healing. The first thing eliminating the past does is to create myopia and guarantee that you'll make the same mistakes twice." Winston Churchill put it succinctly but well when he said, "The farther backward you can look, the farther forward you will see." The snowflakes want to revise or remove everything that does not come up to what they call our moral superiority. Our moral superiority? America is at the lowest moral standard in its existence. Look at television, movies, video games, DVDs, listen to radio and CDs. Science fiction with its savage destruction and killing, always present sexuality, filthy everyday language, all infest our waking hours. And then there are the newspapers. Only a handful of dailies are locally owned. I'm sure most of you know that. The overwhelming number of newspapers belong to giant media groups, and they dictate what news you will get. Smaller newspapers depend on Sunday inserts for their basic income. The credibility of their reporting is costing them thousands of subscriptions, especially when the alternative television is more accessible and certainly far more interesting. Are we supposed to forget the Civil War because it was the climax of the fight over slavery? If so, do we tear down all World War II memorials because the struggle witnessed the birth of the atomic bomb? In like vein, Americans used napalm in Vietnam. Do we send the bulldozers in Washington to destroy that sacred black wall containing the names of 57,000 American heroes? When we remove statues erected by previous generations, we are destroying more than bronze and marble. We are tearing down our nation itself, all the things good and bad and inadequate that made it. Why should we want to hide from an imperfect past when we can learn from it and move toward a more perfect future? A comment of mine who lives here in the valley commented not long ago, "Every monument to a Confederate Virginian is a war memorial to an American veteran. It has been the mark of manhood and civility and long-standing American tradition to leave politics out of the way when we honor our veterans. They fought the battles. We did not. They shed the blood. We did not. They reconciled with their enemies. We did not. They were tried on the battlefield and tried by a jury of their peers in the only court of opinion that mattered, their own generation. The generation that knew the issues, heard the speeches, offered their lives in defense of their country, and pulled the triggers. The battlefield determined the outcome, and the veterans pardoned their enemies." End of subject. Winston Churchill gave us a much better warning, and it's a favorite warning of mine. When the present begins arguing with the past, you have likely lost the future. History shows that we get exactly what we deserve. Only when Americans become more aware of their history will they become more respectful of it. And when the respect grows, unity and brotherhood will not be far behind. Nothing is more critical to the future of liberty than how we educate our children. And the modern trend to drop from the curriculum such subjects as history, geography, grammar, penmanship, all for the sake of computer science courses, may increase technical skills, but it destroys culture, the very thing that civilization is supposed to nurture. Cultural illiteracy is fast becoming a way of life in America. We need more memorials. We yearn for more reminders of how far we have come and the obstacles we have overcome in the long journey. Obliterating memorials will not change yesterday. Learning from them can change tomorrow. Some 150 years ago, our greatest president gave us a sharp warning. America, he said, will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedom, it will be because we destroyed ourselves. We cannot sit idly and quietly and allow these incendiaries to run loose. Speak up. You have a voice. You got a telephone. You have a computer. But you also hold a much more powerful weapon. You have the ballot, the vote. We have long been a nation with a minority government. You probably don't know this. But in any presidential election, about 40% of the electorate will show up. Let me put it another way. In any presidential election, 3 out of 5 Americans don't care. They don't bother to vote. And the statistics are even worse down on the lower level, where government should be more important because it touches your life so closely. 2 months ago, I spoke in a well-known town in this state, and I spoke to a longtime friend who was mayor of that town for years and years. And in the discussion, he pointed out with a chuckle that he first won victory when 19% of the electorate voted. Now, 19% would consist, I suppose, of his neighborhood in the main, the congregation at church, people he met on the streets, and maybe a couple of ads he took in the newspaper. That'll get you 20%. It got him victory. 19%, 4 out of 5 Americans didn't give a hoot about who was mayor, and yet the mayor is running the city in which you live. Something's wrong there. We've got to stop it. And you can stop it in local elections. You know, each one of you knows 2 friends who are lethargic, not going to bother to vote. Tell your 2 friends to vote. Take your 2 friends to the ballot box. Take your 2 friends and your 2. You'll win the election. Simple as that. You'll get a head start on it all. Now, we've got to stop at all levels electing candidates who stage grand spectacles, talk a good game, but are hesitant to block legislation that threatens our heritage. We call such protection of our heritage by a special word. It is patriotism. At election time, find out from candidates how they feel on the monument issue. Do not settle for the usual circumventing spiel that they have developed. Demand from them publicly a yes or no on the monument issue. If they need to think about it, well, ignore them as a candidate until they make up their minds and are ready to give you a yes or no. That's the way you overcome this crisis. Again, my favorite motto, history is the best teacher we will ever have. We need every reminder we can get, warts as well as beauty spots, to help us understand today while we contemplate tomorrow. We face too much unfinished work to cease striving to make our country what Lincoln called it, the last great hope of earth. And another spokesman also commented on hope. He said, "The march of providence is so slow, and our desires so impatient. The work of progress is so immense, and our means of aiding it are so feeble. The life of humanity is so long, and that of the individual so brief, that we often see only the ebb of the advancing wave and are thus discouraged. But it is the study of history that teaches us to hope." Those were the words of Robert E. Lee. Could he, will we, still hope? We must, if America is to survive. So let us crown our good with brotherhood and emphasize anew that long-expressed prayer, America, America, God mend thine every flaw, confirm thy soul with self-control, thou liberty in law. Thank you very much. Thank you. This thing is going to lose. We have
time. We have time for questions. We do have time for some questions. If you'd like to ask Dr. Robertson a question and head over to the microphones, we'll take a question at a time. Just after the questions, we will have a few minutes, about 15 minutes break.
If I might start with the first question, because it's going to come up. I'm not sure Christy Coleman is here yet. I'll just hold this. But I want to commend her and her committee for their recommendations with the Richmond Monument Avenue things. I was on CBS Sunday morning in October of last year, and I said the same thing, that if one of those memorials has to come down, it should be the centerpiece, the Confederate States Memorial with Robert E. Lee. Now, let me explain before you start frothing at the mouth. For once, look at the Confederate States of America for what it was, a giant evolutionary stage in the building of the greatest nation planet Earth will ever know. View it as a stepping stone, a vital, imperative stepping stone toward modern day. So on the monument itself, I think when you find the alternative for what you're going to put in place of it, let it be something like, from the Confederate States or from the Southern effort came our present United States. And now they're arguing over who's going to replace Jefferson Davis. Davis was a great man. He achieved greatness before the Civil War in the Senate and as Secretary of War, hero in the Mexican War. But among those 5 memorials, he is the non-Virginian in the crowd. We don't need some other statesman of a non-Virginia variety. What I would hope the committee would think about is not a figure, but a montage of figures. A man, a woman, an adult, a child, a black, a white, an Hispanic maybe, or Native American maybe. A montage of figures that represent the great mass of American people. Not just white folks, not just black folks, but all folks. And let them be the centerpiece that from that heading, from the Confederate States, or whatever you want to call it, came the great United States. And the great United States is this wonderful mixture of human beings that makes us the most powerful nation on earth. Well, that's what I hope for it. And again, I want to congratulate Christy for what they have recommended. Implementing it will probably be the greater problem. All right, let's go over that.
Hello, thank you for that beautiful speech.
Is the microphone on?
Well, maybe he can relay it. I have a hearing problem, so go ahead.
Just thank you for that beautiful speech. Is there a way that we will be able to get access and read it at our leisure? Will we be able to?
Is there a way that we can get access and read this speech at our leisure?
No, ma'am, and I'll tell you why. I plagiarized. And I didn't. I don't mean that in a negative sense. I used comments from a dozen different people and a dozen sources, and I didn't use quotation marks because I was emphasizing things to which I agree very strongly. And if I let the thing be public, somebody's going to call me. Harold Holzer, for example, called me and say, "What the heck are you doing to my words," etc. So, but I appreciate the sentiments very much.
Many people in Charlottesville take an opposing view. One of the things that concerns me is that it seems that the last time this came for a vote in the Virginia legislature, that it pretty much went along party lines. And so the question is, if the state legislature flips and becomes Democratic, do you think that the representatives or the delegates will continue to vote along party lines, or will any of them approach it from the standpoint that you're suggesting that it be approached from?
I think they will approach it from party lines because politics supersedes principles. But I hope with all my heart they'll remember that they are Virginians, and the state and its history are far more important than simple politics. Yeah, in both House and Senate, subcommittees killed the Toscano vote by a 7-6 vote, and if the Democrats take control, they undoubtedly will move to take the statute down. And I can't get my Democratic friends, particularly one senator with whom I'm very, very close, and he's a Democrat, and he just says he's caught between a hard place, and he loves history, but he's part of the party, and you have to go along with the party. It's just the sorry state we're in. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I don't think this one is working either, is it? No. Okay. I'll talk loud. I really appreciated the way in which you looked at the historical significance of this issue. And I agree wholeheartedly with the need for more historical information in our already crowded lives of learning. But then when you mentioned asking a politician whether they were for the monument should stay or should go, it dwindles down to yes or no. And to what extent does a no answer, no, don't tear down the monuments, leave them as they are, to what extent should we be emphasizing that leaving them also entails the responsibility to educate people on the society, the times, and the contexts in which these people that are being memorialized lived and conducted themselves?
I think that issue will be resolved by the incident itself, first of all. Secondly, I think putting up plaques, and there are many, many people who agree, and my friend Harold Holzer leads the group. We need plaques to put up there. And what I said worldwide over CBS Sunday Morning is, I want to change the Lee Monument. I want to get him out of a uniform coat. I want him in civilian clothing, because I think his greatest achievement was in saving this country. U.S. Grant won the war. Robert E. Lee saved the peace. And we meet today because of those two men, not one, because of them.
But
and
not many people know
Lee
that.
in civilian clothing would do it. But the cost of just switching his coat would be astronomical. We just... That's enough, I think, to say.
Let me interject with a point of order here. Please keep your questions brief. Don't hide statements in questions. And I hate to say that. I'm dear friends with all of you, but we have a lot of people that would like to ask questions, and we have a very short amount of time. Get up to the microphone, ask your question, and wait for your answer.
Okay, over here.
Another thing that you mentioned, we're missing ignorance, amnesia. You did mention impatience. So without asking a historian to give a soundbite in the argument in response, what is a soundbite to sort of turn the argument on its head when you're having a conversation, which is the first battle to get to a conversation? To add statues, like instead of being obstructionist is a better way to frame it, we want to add statues.
The one soundbite. He fought for a nation, that he fought for his country, a nation he thought would stand. Lee did not see the big picture. None of them did. Going back to the Confederate States and changing that monument. Have you ever thought of what this country would be like if the South had won? We would be the Balkans of the Western Hemisphere. 48 little principalities begging for independence, sustenance, and survival. What would Massachusetts have in common with Mississippi? What would Texas have in common with Indiana? Nothing. Nothing. We would not be a threat to anybody, except maybe the Mexicans or next door Canadians. But those 48 little principalities coming together produced a sum so much heavier than the sum of the parts. And I think that's the thing I would point out. That in this war, they fought to try and establish the lines of federalism and where the United States was going. And Lincoln maintaining that the Union was perpetual, and Southern states maintaining that secession was legal, is a contest with no middle ground. You are a Union or you are separate. And so I would try to work up a soundbite, something to that effect.
We'll take just 2 more questions, starting with this one over here.
Yes, I've read over and over again that the statue's construction came in 2 waves. The first was to reinforce the oppression of African Americans during the time of lynching, and the second was during the time of segregation. I thought that the construction of the statues always had more to do with, first, the passing away of the soldiers themselves, and the second wave would have something more to do with the Civil War centennial. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I don't. I'm not sure I understand your question, but I can say that the first monuments did not begin until about the late 1880s. I know that during the decade of the 1890s, 300 monuments were placed on the Gettysburg battlefield. 300 in 10 years. In the South, 1, Robert E. Lee in Richmond. I just disagree strongly with those who say that the South put up the monuments in open defiance. Defiance of what? The South is trying to get back on its feet again. And the race question was one of several issues that was holding the South back. But getting rid of the monuments is taking away our past. And we are courting death as a nation if we allow that. When I went to Emory, the first axiom I learned is that in the 3,000 years of recorded history, any nation that forgets its past has no future. History is undisputable on that point.
Last question.
What can we do as individuals